Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, the new standard for driver scorecards. I'm so glad you can join us. A little bit about IFTA. For those of you who might be new to our organization, the International Food Service Distributors Association, or IFTA, is a premier trade association representing food service distributors. We're dedicated to enhancing the success of our members by providing valuable resources, fostering industry collaboration, and advocating for a thriving food service distribution sector. You can learn more about us at our website, iftaonline.org. My name is Serena Moriarty. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager of Engagement at IFTA. I'm excited to be moderating here today and guiding you through our discussion. Before we dive in, I want to give a big thank you to the presenters here today from Netradyne and from Gridline, Cyrus Mostashari, Mason Levinson. Netradyne is a leading provider of software that supports fleet management, fleet safety. They are a developer. Their support makes webinars like this possible, so take a moment and visit their website. It's at netradyne.com, and you can learn more about everything they have to offer. A quick look at what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to talk about how to reduce accidents and claims through monitoring driver scores, year-over-year trends for telematics data, and customer best practices. Throughout the presentation, we're going to encourage you to use the discussion board. You'll see a box over there on the right where you can drop your questions. We're going to monitor the discussion, and then we'll have a Q&A point at the end of the presentation. And just as a reminder, the recording of the webinar will be posted to our website following today's presentation. So if you miss anything or you want to revisit any slides or grab contact information, you'll be able to find it there. And now on to the presentation. Cyrus, Mason, thank you.
Great, thanks, Serena. All right. So thanks everybody for joining. Cyrus and I are excited to have everyone. So the new standard for driver scorecards. Elements of a good scorecard is where we wanted to start, so everybody can gain an understanding of what we've done with driver performance and how to deliver that message. So a driver scorecard to evaluate positive behavior or areas to work on should provide full context. There should be a dynamic approach to driver scoring. Make sure to highlight good driving, because we understand that a professional driver is doing the right thing most of the time. There should be a self-managing part of the scorecard where drivers understand their score and what contributed to that. And then everything about a driver performance scorecard should be actionable. How are we going to make our drivers safer out on the road to guarantee they're getting home safe at night to their families? How do we make sure that they're always learning new laws, new regulations, and just an overall fleet safety that drives positive behavior? So we touch on a few of those items to kick it off, where the big overarching message with both Cyrus and I is that information management and scoring is how telematics will get used going on in the future. So you should be able to easily analyze historical data. There should be a connection between scores that managers or fleet safety can recognize what's affecting what. How does one aspect of our safety program affect another in either a positive or a negative event? And how can we use these exceptions that we're getting out of our tools to uncover hidden patterns in data? At the end of it, companies invest a lot of time, resources into the technology to create a safe driving environment, and you should be able to make a data-informed decision. So, where scoring starts and how it should be looked at in a dynamic way. We like to start with the easier or the more scoped down approach, where you analyze a driver's day, a driver's week, or a month, and you want to include everything that's important to your fleet. So for fleets that are hours of service, that are also tracking idle and a driver's mile per gallon, and also safety. So a driver has a clear understanding of all these contributions to their score. They know what to go work on, and they also understand what they're doing very well. So you want to have a conversation with the driver all at once that says, here's what you're doing great. Here's a couple things we can work on to improve. Now, with fleets that have a lot of moving parts and there's several distribution centers or there's several different groups that bubble up to the main company, it should be easy to also look at locational performance. So when you're analyzing, is my fleet safe, you can look at where the target areas are. So if you're comparing California to Arizona to Texas versus New York, you should be able to really look at those fleet scores versus each other so you can start to understand who needs the most help, where can I work first, and make the biggest improvement. Now also, there's this general idea where you want to have a national average. And where telematics is going with scoring and just with data overall is how do I compare to everybody else in the world or in the US? But the best place we've found to start is setting a national average for your own fleet. And national average can mean several things. We use that word because it's so broad, but national average could be a fleet that has assets traveling through all 50 states. Or it could just mean we have 50 to 100 vehicles moving through one state, but they're all grouped, and we would just want to compare the groups. So when an average is set and there's a group or a driver below that average, you can now have that conversation that says, hey, you're a little bit below the national or the company average. And we just worked on a couple things here. You'd be well above that average. You know, this is where we want you to hit, but we also want you to exceed that. Here's where you can get better. Historical data has also been top of mind for us and something that we believe is powerful for companies to use. And it should be a little bit different than when we think historical, let me check last week or last month compared to what we're doing now. And being able to compare 3 years of historical data lets you know where you've had past success or failure. So if you pull up every single one of your company's safety exceptions in 2023, you compare it to overall safety exceptions collected in 2024. Now we're at the end of 2024. You can make a plan going into 2025 of where do we want to focus on. If you look at just a dashboard and you try to identify where to work, it could look like you guys always have an issue when there really is one main issue the company needs to work on. A lot of times we identify that's driver speeding, distracted driving. Everybody's familiar with the most common safety exceptions that happen. But when you are able to look at it year over year, you can really identify what should we hyper focus on, because you want to find something to make the biggest improvement the fastest. Trend lines are always great as well. Not that it shows anything different from looking at raw data or from looking at bar charts, but a trend, easy to look at, it's easy on the eyes, it's easy to explain to the peers in your company or to other people and drivers where there's upticks in safety events or you guys are improving. So if you implement a new driver incentive program or if you implement new technology, you can really identify where you're getting better and where you're getting worse. And a lot of the times it depends on the time of the year. There's industries where thousands and thousands of more miles are driven in the summer versus in the winter. And that's just tribal knowledge that fleets need to understand. In the summer, we're driving so much more that we really need to focus on driver safety. So comparing your fleets, groups, or comparing your drivers, any kind of comparison you're doing should definitely be historical, and it should have a ton of easily accessible data so that a couple clicks of a button, you can look at that. You should be able to also have different kind of date ranges to look at. So not only are we going to look at year over year, but I should be able to identify really easily, did we get better from Q2 in 2024 versus Q2 in 2023? or show me everything year to date last year versus year to date this year, because when 2024 ends, I want to know if I'm on the right path or not. And it should definitely include all of the things you're tracking a driver against. They need to know what the company is looking at, so nothing's hidden. In one scorecard, it should include everything that they're tracked so they can make the biggest improvements themselves. We know drivers want to do well. And there's also the natural human competitive edge. They want to be best in the fleet, so they should be able to understand how to do that. Couple different ways to identify these patterns. So if you're looking at the technology that you implemented and you want to look, did we get better month over month or year over year? It can come in a bunch of different ways, but at the end of the day, it needs to be easily digestible so you guys can make action plans out of it. You should be able to look at idle by cost, by percentage, by duration, all these different ways to digest data and then go do something with it. Something Cyrus and I talk about sometimes, where fleets come in and there's just so much going on, and there's groups inside the fleets that there's 100 drivers in one group and there's 50 drivers in another, and there's only 10 in the satellite location, and it's really hard to talk to that fleet or the group inside the fleet that has only 10 drivers because they don't generate that many events, not as many drivers, not as many miles driven. So when you take a scorecard or the scoring aspects that's important to your individual fleet, you should have this way that you normalize the data. So it's not just a gross amount of events versus the other. It should be who's most at risk, because I need to work with who's most at risk in the beginning or first. Because my driver that drives 1,000 miles versus my driver that only does 150, it's really hard to compare them without this kind of analysis. The driver that has 1,000-mile week, it's just so much more opportunity to get to capture exceptions. So you need to fairly evaluate the fleet. So having an easy way to normalize data per 100 miles is exactly how we're doing that today. And then at the end of it, it should, just to wrap, it's everything that we're talking about. So it should just be really easy to capture years of data, make the comparisons, identify the most easy to tackle problems, and then reward the drivers and the groups that are doing a great job. Cyrus, this is where I'll hand it over to you. We'll just end right here with one of our current customers that we take care of today.
All right, Mason. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody here, for joining this. I'm very excited to talk to you about a little bit more about how Netradyne takes a look at driver behavior and helps make drivers safer. So for those of you who don't have the context, Netradyne's mission is to increase safety on the road. How we do that is by changing driver behavior to a more safer behavior on the road. And the technology that we employ to do that uses AI to analyze every single minute of driving, both inside and outside of the cab, and actually generate a very fair assessment of how the driver is doing, and then co-pilot that driver to become safer. So there's an ecosystem there that's at work. The first thing is that there's a camera inside of the cab. The camera uses computer vision to analyze driving, and in real time gives drivers feedback on what they're doing well and what they should be improving on. An example of that would be if the driver is distracted, the camera will tell them, you're distracted, please pay attention. There's also a driver app where the information and the score that the driver has is all aggregated. There's self-coaching things in there that the driver can see and understand how they've been driving and what they can improve. And finally, there's a manager portal, right? So for the fleet safety managers, the coaches, there's a whole module where they can go in, just like what Mason was referring to, have a top-down view of how their fleet is doing, all the way down to drivers, and then who needs to have the most improvement and what are the events that they need to improve upon. So those are generally the three big pieces that bring Netradyne safety solution to life. And then next slide, please. So at the heart of this ecosystem, there's a score that we create. It's called the Green Zone score. And this is very similar to a FICO score, but for driver safety. It's incredibly comprehensive. It uses every single minute of driving, analyzes it, and then again, it uses both positive behavior and behaviors that are unsafe and need improvement to give the driver and their managers a really, really comprehensive view of how they're doing and where they need to improve. The Green Zone score is out of about 1,000, and 850 and above is usually the range where the drivers get very safe. However, we have a lot of competitive drivers in our system that have scores way beyond that. Next slide. So this is sort of the key differentiator in how the Green Zone score works versus traditional solutions that do this, is the legacy sort of event recorder type of solutions focus on detecting severe alerts, right? So there's all of this like sort of driving minutes, and what they do is they identify a sliver of that that's risky behavior. Whereas the Green Zone score actually looks at all of this drive time, and no surprise, most of it is actually good, safe behavior. And then there's portions that are mild risk, portions that are severe risk, and portions that are moderate risk. All of this is accounted for along with the context that the driver is driving in to make sure that we create something that's extremely comprehensive and a true fair look at how the driver is performing. And then we're able to share that sort of pie chart with them, right? Of all the drive time that we've analyzed, here's the moments where you have mild risk versus where you're doing perfect driving versus where there's some severe events that you need to correct. Next slide. So these are some of the factors that go into the Green Zone score and their values. This is a always evolving thing. So actually later this year, we're going to release another version that will have forward collision warning and weaving incorporated into it as well. But the current version that we're on, version 3, incorporates these factors, and they have different weights based on their correlation to collisions. So how we built the score is we actually look at billions of miles of data, and we see what behaviors either cause a collision. So in the case of like distraction and traffic light, these are things that happen, milliseconds, seconds before the collision occurs. But for some of the other ones like hard acceleration or U-turn, these are things that are correlated with the driver getting into collision in time. So what we do is we look at the effect of all of these on collisions in real life, and then we create the weight of them and the impact of them on the score based on that. At the bottom there, we always have something called driver stars. Driver stars are both situational and durational. These are the sort of thumbs up good behaviors that we give to the drivers. So an example of a situational driver star would be if somebody pulls up in front of you and cuts you off and you slow down and you create distance, you get a driver star. The driver is notified of that, but they also get points added back to their score as a result of it. We also have durational driver stars, which are like, hey, over time, if you encounter 75 stop signs and you have a 90% perfect stop sign compliance, then you get points added to your score as well. And there's a whole variety of those around alertness, around following distance, pulling over from the shoulder when there's a vehicle there, that help the drivers help recognize the good behaviors that the drivers are doing, but also give them this control on earning back points if, for example, they roll the stop sign at some point, right? They can make the points back up. This actually creates huge engagement with the drivers and allows us to gamify the system and get the drivers to buy into it and, realize that, hey, I'm recognized for the good things that I do as well. And I can actually have power over doing those, right? And adding points back as opposed to just waiting around for the system to tell me that I'm doing something wrong. So that has not only is positive reinforcement, which we'll talk about, help actually enforce good behavior and is more effective than things like punishment, it actually helps with engagement as well, right? And gamification. Next slide. So Mason had a really good point about how do you make sense of all this data, right? If you're a fleet that has thousands of drivers, it's really difficult to start with the drivers, right? And be like, I have 400 drivers to coach. So we have a concept in our system, which is a hierarchy concept. So all of the data that we create, the Green Zone score, is captured at the daily driver level. From there, we create an aggregate of that score based on the analyzed minutes and the score average. And we can roll that up across a hierarchy. So you have the individual driver score, and then you can see what, if you put the driver, you can put them in a hierarchy of groups. But you can base that based on a driver group that's within a location, and then still see the score for the location. And then the location could be in a region. And that all rolls up to the fleet green zone score. So a lot of what we show in terms of analysis starts sort of with the fleet, and then the fleet, say, has regions like California and New York. And then within those, there's locations like San Diego and New York City. And then within that, there could be, other segmentations, right? The groups could be based on different offices, different terminals. And so the users are able to understand what the fleet's risk is and what the performance is as a high level, and then drill down to the areas and eventually to the drivers that need improvement, as opposed to being kind of lost in all of the data that we create. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about, how our score analyzes every minute and how it looks at positive behavior and also unsafe behavior that needs to be improved. But one of the other important things that we take into account is the driving context. So we don't score, for example, if two people violate a stop sign, we don't score them the same way. Our system actually looks at the context and knows how many stop signs did this person encounter today. So one person violating one stop sign out of 10 versus somebody violating one stop sign out of 5, these two people will get different deductions applied to them. So it's not just about, hey, recognizing this behavior and that behavior, but how do you analyze it and score it in a fair and comprehensive way? Involves actually detecting neutral events. So that also applies to traffic lights, right? It applies to when we do things that are durational. We look at how many minutes did you drive, and out of those, how many were you severely distracted versus the ones where you were kind of distracted. We do the same thing with speeding, right? So we look at all the minutes that you drove, how many of those minutes ended up being way above the speed limit versus ones that are a mile or two above. And so our scoring really works more than just looking at alerts and driver stars, positive and negative slivers of behavior, but it looks at how those fit a context and creates a score that, again, is both fair and comprehensive. Next slide. So this is just a continuation of that. You can go back for just a second, Mason. So in this case, we see, driver 1 is Joe. They have 5 stop sign alerts out of 95. So their stop sign compliance is about 95%, right? So they, out of 100, so 95 full stops, 5 stop sign alerts. So their compliance is very high. On the other side, you see Peter, 4 stop sign alerts out of 16, right? And their compliance is about 80%. So at first glance, you might say, hey, Joe is a more chronic stop sign violator than Peter if you just looked at 5 versus 4. But our system allows you to understand what the compliance numbers are. And in that scenario, you see that Joe actually has higher compliance, even though they have 5 stop sign alerts. All right. So this is a sort of an example of how the score would work, like a day in the life of a driver. So the driver drives, they have to drive for about 30 minutes for us to even put a score together. So it's not like everybody starts with a perfect score, and then if they drive for 5 minutes and they don't do any violations or get any positive recognitions, that will just give them a high score or a perfect score. We actually have to analyze at least 30 minutes to generate a daily score. Once that first 30 minutes goes by, the driver gets a certain score. So in this example, driver might start after the 30 minutes with an 845. They go throughout their day, they get distracted, the score drops to an 805. Then they get they do a positive event, right? And they do something proactive, like creating distance. They get a driver star, their score goes back up. As the day goes on, they speed a little bit, the score goes back down. But then by the end of the day, we assess their stop sign compliance and say you have 100% perfect compliance. We add some back to the score. And so eventually they end up with an 855 throughout the day. So I touched on this a little bit earlier, but the power of positive reinforcement is very, very well understood science that's been studied across a lot of different industries, a lot of different work environments. And a huge part of what's been found is that if you give your employees thanks and recognition for the things that they do well, they build a lot of trust in the organization. So, and when you have more trust, you put more energy and effort into your work. So that's no different than our system. We had seen that in the status quo, there was a lot of what did you do wrong, right? What do you need to fix? What are the opportunities for improving your safety? But what we found is actually if you do the positive reinforcement and you emphasize the things they're doing right, they'll continue to do those things. They'll have more trust in the system and in their safety organization in general. And eventually that leads to safer roads in a much more effective way for all the stakeholders in the safety process. Next slide. So here's a little bit of just data around the correlation between severe alerts and the score. So I showed you a little bit of the spectrum earlier of what impacts the score the most. All of this is done in a scientific way, but in general, like if you look at the score and you see the score go up, you'll see that the severe risks are being reduced, right? And so this is a view that shows you that there's definitely a connection between those two things. So things like distraction, for example, will go down as the score go up. Traffic light violation, speeding. And a lot of our fleets see that connection between things that are comprehensible in the real world and what the score is saying. Next slide. So one of the things that we normally see is that there's a huge chunk of improvement that happens in the first 90 days when our camera's installed. So there's that sort of early effect of everybody recognizes the things that they're doing that maybe they weren't aware of. I myself, I'm from California, and when I put the camera in my car, I realized what I thought was a full stop sign is in fact not a full stop. So in the first 90 days, we see some very steep improvements, which you'll kind of see from these graphs. And then we see that in the first 12 months, that becomes a little bit more gradual to a point that it kind of levels out to a very safe space when you look at the fleet as a whole. Usually, like I said, our target is above that 850 concept. So if you look then and segment the drivers, you see sort of this steep followed by a very gradual continuous improvement within the fleets. This is an example of how we build the score. Again, I touched on this a little bit earlier. We build the score backwards from accident risk. So this graph actually shows a real study that we do, and we're continuously doing these as our score is in the real world. And then we take a look at what our drivers are doing in the real world and what accidents they're getting into. And we plot those two things together. So in the y-axis of this, you're seeing collisions per million miles. And on the x-axis, you're looking at the score. So here we show this relationship between how as the score increases, we see a lower rate of collision per million miles. The shaded area is an area of margin of error. So no score is perfect, neither is ours, but it's built to be highly correlated with collisions. And we do see that for the most part. There's a vast difference between the drivers that get a 950 out of 1,000 versus drivers that get a 650 out of 1,000 and everything in between. Generally, about 50-point increase in the score correlates to about 13 to 15% reduction in collisions per million miles. So this is another type of case study. I alluded to this in the earlier slides, but in the first 90 days, we see a huge improvement. And so in 2023, we followed 100 different fleets that onboarded during the same time, and they were highly diverse, right? They were from different regions of the United States, different types of businesses. What we saw in the first 90 days was that, first of all, their green zone score increased by about 20%. Based on the data I just showed you, that correlates to about 35% reduction in collisions as predicted by the green zone score. But the most interesting thing that we found was the highest increase was in the number of driver stars that they got, about 72% in the first 3 months. So very interesting. It just reaffirmed sort of this approach that positive reinforcement engages the drivers more. and modifies their behavior more so than identifying severe risk and those other behaviors. So we've always continued to double and triple down on that. You know, our system about a year and a half ago only had about 5 to 6 opportunities for drivers to earn points, and that's about doubled now in the newer version. But we also see reductions in stop sign violations in those first 90 days, a huge reduction in severe alerts as well, and then also a reduction in things like distraction. So everything that we do in the system is very transparent and very objective in terms of what are the behaviors that you have. You, as the driver, you get to see the alerts that you're getting yourself. You get to see your score. You see the counts and the violations that you've done. So you can self-correct yourself, right? And be able to coach yourself first and foremost. When you do need to have those conversations, we also generate a scorecard. It's very much like a school report card that shows all of the different analyzed minutes, what portions of those are perfect driving green minutes, what are the alerts that are impacting the score, which ones are the top ones, and what would your score be if you corrected those behaviors. So in the case that we're looking at to the right side here, this driver has stop sign and speeding violations, and their score is a 675, which we really want to improve. But if just those two behaviors are corrected, the driver will end up with an 831, which, if you remember in the last few slides, a person with a 650 to an 850 will almost have cut their likelihood of collisions by half. So huge impact focusing on two behaviors, and the system automatically generates and shows that. So what we try to do is focus a lot on self-coaching. So self-coaching, just like I said, with positive reinforcement, when you get the driver engaged in their safety, the more you do that, the more effective the program becomes. So self-coaching first and foremost starts with the in-cab alerts. So the camera, for example, if you're distracted, will tell you, we've detected distraction, please put your phone down. If you put your phone down, you won't even get a distraction alert generated. That won't even impact your score. There'll be no alert sent to your manager, none of that, or to your own app. Now, if you don't correct that behavior, then in the driver app, we create not only the data and we show it to you and the stuff that I showed earlier, but we also create virtual coaching sessions, which again, focus on showing you the videos and the behaviors that you're doing, that if you self-correct, will impact your score and improve your score. Generally, we see in our data that drivers that have the app and engage in self-coaching perform better and have higher scores. Next slide. So at the end of the day, we have 3 different layers, right? Layer 1 was the in-cab coaching. That is very effective. If that doesn't work, you get the virtual coaching session. You can self-coach yourself. If the behaviors are still not corrected through those 2, then we have the portal for the safety manager to have the conversation with the right kind of drivers. We typically see that this ends up being an edge case. This is a smaller percentage of drivers. Most of the correction happens with the in-cabs and the self-coaching. But there are scenarios where you do need to coach the driver. In that case, our portal identifies drivers with the highest scores and the lowest scores. As I said, that applies to regions and sort of that top-down analysis concept. But it easily allows users to be able to recognize regions, areas, locations where they should be rewarded for safe behavior and have the highest scores versus ones that have opportunities for coaching. So here's an example again of what a manager would see in the portal for a driver. They'll take a look at what the driver score is, how it's been trending over time, and then what are some of the risky behaviors. In this case, we see U-turn and risky following distance, and what the projected score would be if the U-turn or following distance event was corrected. And right from this portal, they can generate a coaching session, add alerts to this, and then take notes and foster a conversation with the driver, complete the coaching session, and now there's a record between the 2, right, of the goals that they've set, that the coaching session did happen, and here's the focus area. And then they can come back in a week or 2, depending on what goal they've set, and see if those goals were met or if there's other areas of opportunity that the driver needs to work. So Mason, I think you want to maybe review this. I think this is a slide that we've covered at this stage. I can hand it to you.
Yeah, this was just in closing. So for everybody, just to summarize again, how we're moving forward with scorecarding and driver performance evaluation is it should provide full context, should be dynamic for analysis, highlight good driving, actionable data, should be able to have a driver self-manage to a certain extent, and then gamify. Let them know that everybody's doing a good job. We're all one fleet working towards a safety goal.
Couldn't agree more. So I think at this stage we can open up to any questions.
Thank you both. I really appreciate your insight on this and your expertise. It's not often that on my end, I get to talk to people who are managing the day-to-day for safety. We have a couple of questions that popped up in here. We're good on time, so I'm just going to jump right in with the first question. And you guys can answer with whoever it applies to as the topic expert. First one, do the green zone alerts and algorithms change over time?
Yes, they do. So we don't, there is a change that the fleet needs to prepare for. So we're not updating the green zone score like every week, right? So we actually release a version of the green zone score every year or two, and we give fleets a long time to kind of prepare for that. There's a period of opt-in, and then at some point the actual switch happens. But the general answer to this question is that yes, as we grow, our data grows, we learn more information, and we have new ways of detecting driver behavior. We modify the score, and our sort of guiding principle here has to do with collisions, right? So like I said, we look at and say, okay, based on the new data that we have, has the correlation to collisions changed? Is there new events that we need to incorporate in there, or do we have to change the weight and how we calculate current events in the score based on what we know of the data?
Okay. Curiously, our next question says, how often are there false positives on event alerts, and how do those affect the score?
Another great question. So when we have a lot more behaviors that we detect today, and not all of them are included in the green zone score. So sometimes when we start with the behavior, right, our false positive rate is much higher. For the green zone score, we have a very strict criteria. So those detections need to get very, very mature. And we have about a 95% false, you have a 5% false positive tolerance for alerts that make it to the green zone score. Now, in those cases, the managers can still reject those alerts, right? And their effect from the green zone score would be wiped. But we don't introduce alerts into the score that have any more than a 5% false positive rate. For most of the alerts that impact the green zone score, the false positive rate is somewhere around 2 to 1%. So it's very, very low.
Okay. The next one up here says, can fleet and safety managers change the scoring weights assigned to events?
So we do this based on science, right? So we don't really encourage that the score is changed based on any other thing than the data. We're a highly data-driven company, and the reason the score works is we look at billions and billions of miles, which subjectively a person in their lifetime will never have that much visibility into. That being said, we do have some reporting tools that allow for what-if scenarios, right? So what if this behavior didn't happen? Or what if my fleet didn't have U-turns, right? So they can see what the green zone score would look like with and without certain alerts. It's also worth mentioning that for different fleets, different sizes of vehicle, we have different thresholds for alerts, right? So, a hard acceleration, the way that it's triggered is not the same for a class 8 vehicle as it's for a class 1. For weaving, for example, the way we assess it for different classes is different. So a lot of the nuance that would be incorporated into a fleet is already incorporated when we generate the alerts and how it impacts the score. So most of the time, when we explain to the fleets how we're doing the score and things like that, and we give them the what if scenarios, they prefer to use our score. We do have fleets that take our alert rates and they create a completely custom score for themselves. We've seen some do that and actually come back to the green zone score because they just don't see the reduction in accidents when they do that.
Okay, that's really cool. Next question. For fleets that don't supply a device for their drivers and then they won't have drivers using the app, how can they best take advantage of the score and coaching?
Yeah, so a little bit of that still becomes sharing information with the driver, just in a different way. So we have fleets that auto email the scorecard to their drivers, so they can still view that information and have that transparency. But you know, the technology of the app is not necessarily the only way that you can communicate with your drivers. Now, if the device is in there and you don't have the app, right, the device will still do that in-cab co-pilot type of scenario. You have to have the device to generate any information, so that's kind of a necessity to take advantage of Netradyne solution. But if you don't, your drivers don't have the app, they don't have a tablet or the phone, the co-pilot feature on the camera will take care of some of that, and then again, emailing some of these report cards to the driver should work as well.
Okay. The last question I think we have here before we wrap, it's what are some of like the testimonies that you've heard from some of your clients about how people are successfully using the driver scorecards? What's it doing to improve performance? What are the ROIs that you're measuring?
Absolutely. I mean, so we have a lot of different testimonies. The major reason people come to our solution and they stay with us is because they see the reduction in collisions from the score, right? So that's one part of it. You are going to spend money on this solution and you get a return on investment. Now, the cost of Netradyne solution is not just what you pay for the camera. It's also how quickly and efficiently can you coach your drivers and get that score up, right? So another thing that the ROI provides with sort of the self-coaching, with the in-cab coaching things that I mentioned earlier, is that you need to do a lot of very small amount of effort to improve that score. So it's first and foremost a score that's highly correlated with collisions that if you coach to it, gives you an ROI, but also coaching to it and bringing it up is efficient and does not need a lot of manpower. So those are two things. The last thing is driver engagement, right? So getting the drivers engaged, making sure this doesn't cause churn is also really important. And so the feedback we get a lot there is that because we balance and we show a very comprehensive view of the driver, it's easy to gamify it, right? It's also easy to have conversations with drivers when you need to have hard conversations because you can balance that with the positive behaviors that they're doing and the information around the context of, hey, look, like this other person might have had 2 traffic light violations, but yours are 2 out of 2 and his is 2 out of 50, right? So those are really the 3 sort of pillars that I would say we get a lot of positive feedback on and how the customers get an ROI.
Yeah, and I think you touch on something that's really important as well, positive framework, positive reinforcement, and just focusing on the things people are doing well versus focusing on the things people are not doing well. It's an entire mindset shift, and I think what I have seen here, what I'm learning from you is that it makes all the difference in the world. One of the reasons in my line of work that I love marketing is because we test, we track, we keep all the data. The data is neutral. The data is just the data. And if we're presenting and we're coaching information and giving it to people, data is neither bad or, it's just information, and it's how we take that information and manipulate it to make people better at what they do, therefore making us better in our communities and surrounding places. You guys, this was great. I really appreciate your input. If you have any closing thoughts, if you want to share your contact information with the group so they can take a quick screen grab, why don't you throw that slide up and see if that one's up there, and then we'll leave that up. And if anybody has any further questions or they want to engage, please reach out directly to Cyrus and to Mason. And if you have any questions for IFTA, we're always here to help. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank you all.
everybody.
Thank you so much for your time and great questions.